Good evening. I am Jeffrey Leake, and I am on the Personally Speaking Committee for this 2020-2021, that's a mouthful, academic year. I'd like to thank you for joining us for Personally Speaking tonight. For 11 seasons now, with this 2020-2021 series, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences has invited the campus community and the broader community to join the Personally Speaking series that spotlights college faculty and the scholarly research and writing they pursue. We have presented 44 authors with 42 books, ranging in subject from bizarre botanicals to political conventions to a goat castle mystery, with history, psychology, food, and sports, and a score of other subjects mixed in. Thank you to our Dean, Nancy Gutierrez, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, who with the College Advisory Board created Personally Speaking. Since the beginning, Atkins Library has been a valued partner in presenting Personally Speaking. And thank you also to Jerry Carter, Executive Director of the Du Bois Center at Center City, which has been our in-person venue over the past 5 years and a partner for the last 4. Our sincere thanks go to the team with Emerging Media Communications, particularly Natasha Strassner. We appreciate the support of the staff from these organizations and the many of you with us tonight who have joined us through the years. We welcome all of you who are new to Personally Speaking as well. We would like to thank Dr. Joan Lorden, UNC Charlotte Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, and for her support of Personally Speaking all these years. In the future, as in the spring, we encourage you to come back and listen to our other 2 presenters. The first will be in January, Dr. Gabor, who will talk about the people of the river, nature, and identity. I'm sorry. Let me back up. Dr. Gabor and Dr. Oscar Della Torre. Their presentations will be riveting for sure, so we encourage you to look out for information regarding those 2 things. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to tonight's expert. It's my pleasure to introduce Beth Elise Whitaker, who is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Political Science Honors Program. She is co-author of Africa's International Relations, Balancing Domestic and Global Interests. Co-author, as I said, with Dr. John F. Clark, and their book was published in 2018. A central point in the book is the relevance of the continent beyond crisis situations that tend to attract U.S. and world attention. As anyone who Googles Dr. Whitaker can see, she's all in on Africa. As recently as March, she published an essay titled Refugees, Foreign Nationals, and Wageni, comparing African responses to Somali migration in the African Studies Review journal. From hearing about big picture analyses of the continent to research trips to Kenya involving both authors' families, we're in for a treat tonight, up close and personal. So, in our Personally Speaking virtual way, I introduce Dr. Beth Elise Whitaker.
Good evening, and thank you, Jeffrey, for that introduction. I think you may have walked away with my notes, however.
That would not be good.
So I'm delighted to be with you this evening, and I want to start by thanking Dean Nancy Gutierrez for inviting me to be a part of this series. And I also want to thank Mary Ellen Frizzell and Lynn Roberson for all of their support in making this possible. Also, thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here. It would have been nice to be at the Center City building and to follow this with a reception, but the advantage of this virtual forum is that we can be joined by other people that are farther away, including my co-author, John Clark, who is at Florida International University in Miami. So hi, John. And I'm also grateful to all the family, friends, students and former students who have joined us this evening. I plan to speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll follow with questions and answers. But if you have questions that you think of while I'm speaking, I welcome you to submit those to the chat, and those will be moderated and then asked of me when I'm done with my presentation. In October of 1996, I arrived in beautiful Western Tanzania to start my PhD dissertation research on the impact of refugees on host communities in that area. If you look at the map on this slide, I was in the northwesternmost part of Tanzania, border in the area that borders Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo. You'll see on this slide also some people who helped me with my research. In the bottom center is George and Jackie Tibayajuka. At the time, they were working in one of the refugee camps and working for some of the non-governmental organizations there. They were newlyweds. Now they actually have 2 children who are studying at universities in the United States. And then in the bottom left, that's my friend Olivia. Her father was a pastor in another village where I did my research, and he helped a lot in terms of lining up interviews and things like that, and Olivia and I became buddies over time. As I said, what I was looking at was the impact of refugees on host communities in Tanzania. Tanzania had a total population in the country at the time of around 30 million people and was hosting 1.3 million refugees in those western areas. And in fact, in those 2 regions that hosted the refugees, there were more refugees than there were Tanzanians. This next slide shows some photos that I took within the refugee camps. The refugees came from Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo. These are from some Rwandan camps, and you can see in the top left a celebration by school children. In the top right, you can see the expanse of the camp and how spread out it was and how it was organized. There were about 20 of these camps, more of 20 of these than 20 of these camps in Western Tanzania, the largest of which had about 250,000 refugees in it. That was the camp in the bottom left, Banako, and that was a food distribution center, though obviously it was not distributing food that day. So these refugees, most of them arrived in Tanzania in late 1993 and early 1994. So by the time I got there in October of 1996, they had been there for several years. In early December 1996, the Tanzanian government announced that all Rwandan refugees in Tanzania had to leave the country by the end of the month. And they had determined, the government had decided that it was safe in Rwanda for the refugees to return and that they should do so. The Rwandan refugees living in the camps packed up their belongings, but instead of heading west towards Rwanda, they started moving east, deeper into Tanzania, and some of them walking towards Uganda. They did not want to go back to Rwanda. So in response, the Tanzanian army moved in and escorted the refugees down the road into Rwanda. There was only one legal border crossing point for them, and so from the area where I was living, the refugees on average had to walk about 220 kilometers to get to that border crossing point. So it was a long trip and it took many days. The non-governmental organizations that were operating in the area could do little about this forced repatriation operation. They could do little to stop it, but they were permitted to go out on the road and provide support to the refugees as they made this journey, provide food and water and clothing and the like. So this is these are images that I took on December 26th and 27th of 1996 as the refugees were walking down the road. You can see that they had packed their belongings and were on the move. And in the bottom left corner, you can see a woman who actually gave birth during this journey. And then a few hours later, she picked up her baby and continued making the long walk to Rwanda. And then in the bottom center picture, you can see one of the refugee camps that was vacated. So just a few days before this picture, it had been bustling and full of refugees, and then they all left, and it was empty. So necessarily, the sort of focus of my research in Tanzania shifted. And I didn't only look at how the refugee situation affected host communities, but I also started looking at the policy making at the national level. And so over the course of the next 2 years while I was living in Tanzania, I really tried to dig into why the Tanzanian government had decided to send home the Rwandan refugees. And one part of that was a sort of regional strategic decision. Rwanda had never liked these refugee camps along its border. The Rwandan government at the time was a Tutsi minority government. These camps were predominantly Hutu refugees, and so the Rwandan government had always seen these camps as a threat. And so in November of 1996, just a few weeks before Tanzania announced that the refugees should go home, Rwanda had actually attacked similar camps in eastern Congo to disperse those refugees. And it's pretty clear that Rwanda threatened to do the same in Tanzania, and Tanzania decided it's better to just send them home. But perhaps more interesting from my perspective was the domestic political situation going on within Tanzania. In 1992, Tanzania had legalized opposition parties. In 1995, it held its first multi-party presidential election. Coincidentally, it's actually holding a multi-party presidential election today as well. And so there had been some domestic political pressure to do something about the refugee situation in Western Tanzania. I found especially fascinating the fact that the pressure to get rid of the refugees was not, in fact, coming from refugee hosting areas. In those areas, there were really mixed emotions about the refugees. Some people were benefiting from the refugees by getting jobs in the refugee camps or by hiring refugee labor to expand the size of their farms and increase their production. Others were not benefiting so much, but there were mixed emotions about this. But in other parts of Tanzania where they had very little interaction with refugees, very little familiarity with what was going on, the assumption was that this must be a bad situation and the refugees should go home. And that's part of what the Tanzanian government was responding to. And so this whole situation fueled my interest in this intersection between domestic politics and international relations, and how domestic politics influences international relations and vice versa. Which brings me then to the story of the book. I continued to study these issues, both migration in Tanzania and elsewhere in Africa. I also would end up studying sort of the influence of Kenyan domestic politics on their willingness to cooperate with the United States in the war on terror as a Fulbright scholar in Kenya in 2005, 2006. And as I continued to do research in this area or on these topics, I recognized that a lot of the work that was being done in African politics was much more focused on domestic politics within African countries, and particularly democratization. And to the extent that there was work on international relations, it often didn't open up that black box of domestic politics and sort of explore how those two interacted. And so I started to recognize that there was a bit of a gap and there was a need for a book in this area, and I put together some ideas, and then I spoke to Lynn Reiner, who's a publisher who publishes a lot of good work on African politics, and I mentioned to her some of my ideas, and she said, John Clark recently talked to me about some of these same ideas. Maybe you should talk to him. And I knew John Clark from my involvement in African politics networks, and I knew that he also did some work in this area, and that he had done most of his field research in Francophone countries in Central Africa. So I got in touch with him, and we started talking, and over time we developed a book proposal, and next thing you know, we had a contract with Lynn Reiner to write the book, which then meant that we had to write the book. So that process took a little bit longer than perhaps any of us anticipated, maybe especially Lynn. So it took a while, but in part that's because it was much more than a book. In addition to working on the book and writing the book, John and I became good friends. And then we also decided to apply to be co-leaders along with Kennedy Mkutu and Pamela Mbambazi of the American Political Science Association's Africa workshop in Kenya in 2015. So we led this workshop. It was around the theme of conflict and political violence. It brought together emerging scholars from various African countries and a few graduate students from the United States to talk about these themes and present research and talk about publication strategies. And it was a great experience, but it was also great because John and I each brought along our families for this adventure, so I wanted to share a few photos from our safari time in Kenya. As I said, much more than a book, really the beginning of a lifelong friendship. So what did we do in the book? So again, we were really looking at this intersection between the international and the domestic, and we argue that Africa's international relations are shaped by domestic politics, that African leaders, whether they are democratically elected or they have come to power through other means, they face opposition, sometimes from opposition parties, sometimes from rebel groups, and they are trying to secure their hold on power. And so they enter into negotiations, alliances, they negotiate their international relations in such a way that it will help protect their hold on power. And this logic applies to their relations with various different actors, certainly with neighboring countries, as I've already explained some in the relationship between Tanzania and Rwanda, but also with external powers, with international organizations, and even with non-state actors who may cross international borders. So thinking here about things like rebel groups or migrants who become a part of international relations, but they're not representative of a government per se. So what I want to do then with the rest of my time is to provide a few examples of themes and countries that we talk about in the book. And this is sort of consistent with what we do in the book. Africa is a lot to cover. There's 54 countries, and we knew we couldn't cover it all. So each chapter focuses on a given theme within Africa's international relations, but then at the end of each chapter is a case study of a specific country that helps better illustrate that theme. And I thought that would be a good way to organize the discussion this evening. The first case I want to talk about is Zambia, and I'm using this as an example to talk about relations with external powers, particularly with China. As many of you probably know, China has become increasingly involved in Africa and many other regions of the world in recent years. It has been investing heavily in infrastructure, in mining, in resources, in agriculture, and other things. And so they've increased their involvement greatly in recent years. In many authoritarian countries in Africa, this increased Chinese involvement has been very much welcomed because many authoritarian leaders like the fact that China does not tend to put conditions on its aid. The one condition is usually just that you have to cut off ties with Taiwan, and that's not much of a problem for most of these countries. But they don't get involved in domestic politics or putting pressure for democracy or multi-party elections or fighting corruption or things like that. So authoritarian leaders in Africa have generally welcomed Chinese involvement. In more democratic countries, including Zambia, the involvement of the Chinese has often catalyzed a lot of domestic debate about the appropriate level of involvement, whether China should be involved at all, and the concern that their involvement is not doing anything to support democracy and fighting corruption and things like that. And so in the early 2000s in Zambia, this became a source of contention, and particularly there were complaints about working conditions in Chinese-run factories and mines within Zambia. And it was ultimately this negative sentiment and some of these concerns that fueled the political campaign of Michael Sata. And you can see in the bottom left picture here some of his campaign posters. He ran for president in 2006. And he focused a lot on the problems of China's involvement in Zambia and particularly working conditions in these factories and mines. He did not win that election, but he came in second, and he had very strong showing, especially in areas where the factories and mines were located. 2 years later, there was another presidential election in Zambia. The president who had been elected in 2006 died while in office, and so they have a system basically where they do a by-election to decide who's going to fulfill the end of that 5-year term. So Michael Sata ran again, and again he did not win, but he did increase his vote share, and again did it largely by gaining support in these areas that were a bit frustrated with Chinese activities in the area. And then eventually in 2011, You guessed it, he ran again, but this time he won, and he continued to run on this anti-China platform. Interestingly, in 2011, China broke its rule of not getting involved in domestic politics and actively campaigned against him, and said that if he were to win, then Zambia would be cut off from China. But of course, what ended up happening after Sata became president is that it was not China that changed its tune, but rather Sata. He recognized that the Zambian economy needed Chinese involvement in order to survive, and if he wanted to carry out any of the programs that he had promised, that he would need to make nice with China, which he did, and Chinese money continued to flow into Zambia. At this point, Zambia, it's estimated that about a half of Zambia's external debt is to China, and so there's some concern about that for the future. Sata himself did not get to see how this would all play out. He died in office in 2014, though this debate about Chinese involvement in Zambia continues even to this day. The second case study that I want to talk about is Kenya, which is near and dear to my heart since I spent a year there and have done additional research there since I lived there in 2005, 2006. And I want to talk about this as an example of Africa's relations with international organizations, and particularly the International Criminal Court. Many of you may know that the International Criminal Court was created in the early 2000s to have a permanent court to deal with crimes against humanity and war crimes. And many African countries joined this enthusiastically. They signed on as a way of sort of expressing their support for human rights and for democracy, but also at times as a way to be able to go after rebel groups and rebel leaders in their countries that were perpetrating some of these abuses. And Kenya was one of the countries that enthusiastically joined the International Criminal Court. In 2002, Kenya went through its own democratic transition, by which I mean a transition from one party to another through democratic elections. But within a few years, their relationship with the court would change, and it largely centered around the 2007 election. The 2007 election was much more controversial. It pitted the incumbent, the person who had been elected in 2002, against someone who had supported him in 2002, but decided to run against him in 2007. In part, there's some disagreement about this, but Kibaki, the incumbent, had allegedly said that he would only serve one term, and then decided to run for a second term. It was a very close election. All of the polls indicated that it was very close. And then the election was held at the end of December 2007, and they started announcing the results. And they did it much like here, where they'd be scrolling the numbers across the bottom of the TV screen, this percent of precincts reporting, all of that. And it looked like Odinga, the challenger, was on track to win. And then suddenly, the Electoral Commission of Kenya stopped publicly releasing the results and went dark for more than 24 hours. And then they came out in front of the cameras and they announced that Kibaki, the incumbent, had won the election. And 15 minutes later, he was inaugurated for his second term. So this was not very well received, as you can imagine, by Odinga supporters, nor by many observers of the election who were concerned that this was rigged. And unfortunately, it led to violence. And over the next 2 months, about 1,300 people were killed and about 300,000 people were displaced. Eventually, an international team of mediators led by Kofi Annan was involved in negotiating a power sharing arrangement where basically Kibaki was allowed to stay on as president, and then Odinga was given a newly created position just for him of prime minister, and they were meant to share power through this. But Kofi Annan also said, listen, Kenyan courts need to do something to hold accountable the people who are responsible for that violence and for all of these deaths. And if Kenyan courts don't do anything about this, then I am going to turn over the evidence I have gathered to the International Criminal Court. Well, Kenyan courts did not do anything about it, and in 2010, Kofi Annan turned his evidence over to the International Criminal Court. And the ICC did investigations and eventually indicted 6 individuals in Kenya, very conveniently 3 on each side of the violence from the early 2008 time period. And the most prominent of those were Uhuru Kenyatta, who was the son of the first president of Kenya and a supporter of Kibaki, the incumbent in the 2007 election. and William Ruto, who was a Kalenjin politician who had supported Odinga, the challenger, in that 2007 election. As those cases proceeded and the ICC worked on gathering evidence for the trials, Kenya itself was moving towards a new election. It was an election in which Kibaki could not run again. He was term limited since he was in his second term. But two of the leading candidates for president in that next election were Kenyatta and Ruto. And they eventually decided to form a ticket together, with Kenyatta running as the president and Ruto running for vice president. And though they had been indicted by the ICC, they ended up using that as a rallying cry and basically ran an anti-ICC platform, arguing that the ICC was a neo-colonial institution, and that if they could come together, having been on opposite sides of the violence in 2007, 2008, then certainly the ICC should not be messing with the situation in Kenya. And in the election in March of 2013, Kenyatta and Ruto managed to win just enough of the vote that they got just over 50% of the vote, which meant that they could avoid a runoff. And so they became president and vice president. Well, of course, as soon as that happened, the witnesses who had agreed to testify against them at the ICC started recanting their testimony. And eventually enough witnesses, basically all of the witnesses, recanted their testimony because they didn't want to testify against the sitting president and vice president, and the ICC had to close those cases. So the result was that the victims of the post-election violence never got any justice for what had happened, and that's what's depicted in this upper right political cartoon. Finally, the last case that I want to talk about is South Africa. And this is an opportunity to talk about African countries, how they relate to people crossing borders, to migrants. You've probably heard a lot in the news about African migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean to go to Europe. But in reality, 2/3 of Africans who leave their home countries and go to other countries within Africa. It's only 1/3 that go to Europe or elsewhere, but 2/3 go to other countries within Africa. And since the end of apartheid in South Africa in 1994, South Africa has been a desirable target destination for many migrants, in part because it has such a large economy. Unfortunately, it's also been a place where there has been a lot of xenophobia. And the two pictures on the left here are from 2008, when the xenophobia in South Africa got a lot of international attention because it became very violent. There was a lot of looting of immigrant-owned shops, and ultimately something like more than 60 people were killed in this violence. There have also been efforts to mobilize against xenophobia, as you see on the top right. And in the bottom right is a political cartoon by the most well-known political cartoonist in South Africa, sort of mocking the levels of xenophobia within South Africa. The reasons for this xenophobia in South Africa are definitely complex, but a lot of it goes back to sort of the dashed hopes of the end of apartheid. With the end of white minority rule, there was great hope that the African majority in South Africa would finally be able to experience the economic development and growth and end the inequality that existed for so long. Unfortunately, that did not happen. South Africa still faces extreme inequality, widespread poverty, and with that came, of course, frustration. And then with the influx of people from elsewhere in Africa, often that frustration was targeted toward the immigrant community. But what made this even worse or more extreme in South Africa has been the political situation, and particularly the use of xenophobic rhetoric by politicians, basically scapegoating immigrants for all of the problems. They don't want to acknowledge that maybe some of their own policies have contributed to the problems, but it's very convenient to be able to blame immigrants for crime and inequality and lack of economic opportunity. And there's a lot of evidence to show that sort of when some of these politicians make speeches and give these big speeches against immigrants, that is often followed by some looting and violence in immigrant communities within South Africa. South Africa is not alone in this. So actually with some research that I did with a colleague in my department, Jason Giersch, we used survey data from 11 countries within Africa, and we found that levels of xenophobia were higher in more democratic countries in Africa, and especially when people were surveyed closer to a national election, which suggests that around the time of elections, there's this anti-immigrant sentiment that is being put forth by politicians, used as a way to mobilize people, but then also fueling and legitimizing underlying xenophobia in the population. And of course, this is a concern. So those are the three examples I wanted to share. There's a lot more in the book, and I would love it if you want to read the book. And I did pick three examples here that are among the more democratic countries in Africa, particularly to illustrate how this intersection between domestic politics and international relations and how they really inform one another in many ways. So I hope maybe you've learned something. At the very least, for about half an hour, you've been able to avoid news about the U.S. election, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Beth, for a riveting presentation. And to just go right into it, since we've been talking about migration and xenophobia, one of the questions that came through involves Tanzania. And the question is, how has Tanzania managed language assimilation of refugees?
So how has Tanzania managed language assimilation? It's an interesting question. So in those areas in Western Tanzania, the language is spoken. So in Tanzania, Kiswahili is spoken very widely, and it was very useful to me as I did my research. But local languages are also spoken in those areas of Western Tanzania, and the local languages have a lot of similarities to, for example, Kinyarwanda and Kirundi, and so those are the languages of Rwanda and Burundi. And so people were largely able to understand one another. Education in the refugee camps, and this is always a big debate in refugee camps, but education was generally done by refugees. Teaching was done by refugees from those communities, and thus done in the home country language of refugees. And this becomes a bigger issue when refugees stay for a longer term, and there's that question of, are they going to go back, or where will they go to secondary school? Will they go to host country secondary school? And then is it a problem they don't know the language? But I did find in my interactions with refugees, I was primarily interacting with Tanzanians, but many of the refugees in the time that they lived there learned Swahili, and Swahili is such a international language in that region that became a very widely spoken language. So in fact, in, I guess, early 1997, I had the opportunity to go into Rwanda. And at that time, given the very complicated politics in Rwanda, you were sort of taking a position. If you spoke English, you were sort of saying that you supported the new government in Rwanda. And if you spoke French, you were sort of saying that you identified with the old government in Rwanda. So I found that the safest thing to do was just speak Swahili, because so many people, so many refugees had come back into Rwanda, had been learning Swahili in these other countries, and it was very widely spoken.
All right. Another question about immigrants is this. When you discuss immigrants, are you focusing on the national borders that are of a recent political history, or did you consider tribal allegiances as well?
So I'm focusing, for the most part, I've been focusing on the national borders, and this is partly, this is partly because these national borders have become, in some cases, even more rigid than they were, for example, during the colonial era, that national governments really protect them and enforce them, though there is an effort underway in Africa to move towards Africans being able to move around within the continent without needing visas and such. But there certainly is some evidence to suggest that sort of cross-border ethnic connections and things will at least influence relations between immigrants and hosts. It's not always necessarily in a positive way. There used to be this argument that sort of African host communities were especially receptive to immigrants who were coming in who shared an ethnic identity with them, but they came from across the border. Of course, when the colonial powers drew the borders in Africa, they cut lots of ethnic groups in half, and so the shared ethnic identity was seen as a way a source of hospitality. But some more recent research in West Africa actually suggests that may not always be the case. And sometimes when there's a shared ethnicity between immigrants and hosts, that leaders of each of those communities actually play up their differences more and actually are less likely to be as receptive to those immigrants as compared to immigrants from a completely different ethnic group. So there's some interesting dynamics that go on there in different contexts, and it doesn't always, I guess, play out the way one might expect.
All right. Another question. You mentioned that it turns out that in more democratic countries in Africa, there are often higher rates or instances of xenophobia. Do you have an explanation as to why? Is it a selection effect? That's the final question. Is it a selection effect?
Yeah. So this is an interesting issue, and sort of the why is there more xenophobia, more opposition to immigration in more democratic countries, and we certainly have seen. I mean, in some ways, this is sort of the dark underbelly of political liberalization in Africa, though I would argue in some other places as well, and this tendency of politicians to sort of use immigrants as scapegoats and try to immigrants are convenient scapegoats because they can't vote in elections, right? And so turning people against them is sort of part of this, and we've seen this in various countries within Africa. There's also been a tendency at times in the past in some countries, the ruling party was actually the dominant party in some African countries was actually quite welcoming to refugees or to immigrants from other countries. And so then when those dominant parties have opened up to more political competition, those opposition parties have found that to be that immigration issue to be a convenient way to go after that longtime ruling party. And so we've seen that in places like Cote d'Ivoire, for example, where for many, many years, the ruling party in Cote d'Ivoire actively recruited labor from other countries. At one point in the late 70s, I believe, something like 25% of the population living in Cote d'Ivoire was foreign-born, and so there was this, and this was all to fuel their cocoa and coffee industries, and to work on farms to open up new land to farming, but eventually in the 1990s, when that ruling party opened up to competition, that became then a source of contention and ultimately contributed to the violence in that country in the early 2000s. And actually, sort of the definition of citizenship in Cote d'Ivoire is still being negotiated, I would say.
Well, the next question is, well, it begins with a compliment. I appreciate that you are trying to portray African politics as more than just about crisis. Yet the examples you give are just that, political violence that costs lives. Could you give some examples of cases that you looked at that were based on perhaps more mundane concerns?
So more mundane concerns, that's interesting. So I think I would argue that often we sort of look at crisis or, we don't tend to write about things that are mundane, right? Like, they don't draw as much attention. Though we do have some other, we talk, for example, about the process of political liberalization in the book and the role of foreign aid in pushing for that, and sort of the movement toward democracy in countries, and as I said, a lot of the literature in African politics has focused on democratization, but we're looking at it more from what has been the involvement or lack thereof of the international community in pushing for this. We do talk also about international organizations within Africa. So, for example, the movement from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union and the role of that body in trying to play a more proactive role on various issues within Africa, and sort of transforming itself from the OAU had been largely seen as ineffective in dealing with different issues within Africa, whether development or conflict or other things. And the African Union has sought to play a more active role. In fact, what I mentioned before about the movement towards visa-free access throughout Africa is being spearheaded within, under the AU umbrella. So there's a lot of other things within the book that are perhaps, I'm not sure I would call them more mundane because that makes it sound boring, but they're not all crisis situations. And I would argue that I tend to most of my research focuses especially on the migration issues, and I would argue that those are not, sometimes those are refugees, but many times those are people migrating for vastly different reasons and not what I would necessarily term a crisis.
So maybe the short answer to the question is read the book. Are there certain countries where you find refugees? And how long do refugee camps normally exist?
Are there certain countries where you, so are there certain countries that host more refugees, perhaps? Okay, so certainly at the time I was doing my research in Tanzania, it was one of the it hosted one of the largest refugee populations in Africa and in all of the world. These days, actually, that has in recent years been transformed by the crisis in Syria and the fact that many countries bordering Syria are hosting large numbers of refugees. But within Africa, Uganda is now hosting a large number of refugees. And so obviously it depends to some extent on what's going on in neighboring countries. Tanzania itself has long been a very peaceful country, but has hosted over the years refugees from many of these neighboring countries. The latter part of that question was about, how long do refugee situations last? So this varies a lot. But in the study of refugees, there's increasing focus on protracted refugee situations, which are refugee situations that last for more than 5 years. And unfortunately, there's a lot of those, not just within Africa, but globally, a lot of situations where people, cross the border thinking that it might be for a short term, and then it ends up lasting years and years. And you have, in some situations, again, I'm most familiar with the African context, so I'll talk about the Somali camps in Kenya, for example, Dadaab complex of camps. You have, those opened in the early 1990s and still exist, and you have, many children who have been born there and have never actually seen their home country of Somalia. But it's now, going on for close to 30 years. So.
Okay. Now I have a question to share. It's really a compilation, really, of 3 or 4 questions that have come in. And you and I have talked about it somewhat offline, and it's definitely more of a personal nature. And so the question is, how did a non-Black woman, as in a white woman, right, from upstate New York originally, how'd you find your path to the continent?
This? Yeah.
Not just a country or two, the continent.
Right.
Share with us what you can about your journey.
Yeah. So, and it is personally speaking, after all, right? So, well, you mentioned part of it. So I did grow up in upstate New York. And so when I, entered middle school, I had to choose between French and Spanish. At the time, French seemed a lot more relevant. Who knew that Spanish would be so widely spoken throughout the U.S. But at the time, Quebec was quite close. And so I chose French, and I continued to study French through high school and college. And certainly if you speak French and you are interested in traveling globally, then Africa is, there's a lot of Francophone countries within Africa. The irony of it all is that I haven't actually ended up living and doing research in Francophone countries in Africa. Instead, I ended up learning Swahili and living in Tanzania and Kenya, and somehow bumped French basically out of my head somewhere. So, but then the other thing I think is courses that I took as an undergraduate. And so when I got to college, freshman year, I had to take a literature class. And with all due respect to our dean, I didn't want to take Shakespeare or modern American writers like many of my friends were doing. I took an Islamic literature class because I thought it sounded interesting. And then my sophomore year, in the same semester, I took an African history class along with an economic development class. And suddenly, for probably the first time in my life, I saw the intersections between classes that I was taking at the same time. And I said, oh, this whole history of colonialism and exploitation is factoring into the development challenges that these countries are facing today. And I started to sort of put it all together, and it just became more and more interesting to me. So I continued, taking classes on Africa. I did an African Studies certificate as an undergraduate, and then decided to pursue, looking at African politics more at the graduate level. But I think this is one reason that I'm pretty passionate about teaching at the undergraduate level, because it's at that point that you can start making these connections and find things that somehow intrigue you, and you can follow them. For whatever reason, the names of African leaders and dates from African history sort of like stick in my head, and I don't know why, but I found something that I was interested in and curious about and wanted to learn more about, and that's what I did. And so for any students who are watching, I encourage you to find your passion through your classes as well.
Well, thinking indeed matters, right? Another question, and you alluded to this a few moments ago. As you share information about the continent in the book, you conclude each chapter with a case study. Here at UNC Charlotte and throughout the U.S., in fact, we have a number of colleagues who were born in or whose families come from Nigeria. Could you talk about the history of that country and the connections between Nigeria and the U.S.?
Yeah, so certainly it's Nigeria is all countries are important, of course, but Nigeria is the largest country in Africa in terms of population, 200 million people, and a continent of 1.3 billion or something. So it's a significant portion of the population. And in the book, we talk a fair amount about Nigeria, especially its role within West Africa and its leadership in some of the international organizations in the region that I mentioned before. But certainly, and I've experienced this here at UNC Charlotte because I've had so many students in my classes, in my African politics and African international relations classes, who, if they themselves didn't come from Nigeria, their parents came from Nigeria. And so we have a lot of these discussions about sort of the role of Nigeria and the history of Nigeria. I think, obviously, there's a lot of attention to Nigeria in the news right now because of the End SARS movement and the police brutality. And then, of course, in response to the protests, further brutality and killing of protesters. But so Nigeria is interesting in a variety of ways. I would say I find it most interesting with some of the research I'm doing now on Kenya, because it's related. I've been looking at issues of dual citizenship and diaspora voting in Kenya. And so in 2010, Kenya had a new constitution that allowed for dual citizenship and for Kenyans who had left the country to vote from outside, though basically the government has been dragging its feet a lot and not really implementing diaspora voting in any meaningful way. In Nigeria, they've had dual citizenship for a very long time, but they do not have diaspora voting, and many people have been pushing for it, and that's been a big focus of the Nigerian diaspora, is trying to lobby for that right, and the Nigerian government is coming up with different reasons as to why that would be hard to do, and security reasons and other things. But I would say the lesson learned from Kenya is, even if Nigeria were to authorize or allow for diaspora voting on the books, it doesn't necessarily mean they would implement it in practice. And so it's only one step of the process to get those rights. It's then getting the implementation of those rights is another part of it. So there's a lot of really there's a very important role to talk about of Nigeria in the region of Africa, but then also more globally, because it is such a big power and such a large country.
All right. Next question. It's a couple of sentences, but we're going to make it through it. What role did the Cold War play in the conflict spurring refugee movements? If extensive, what are some of the remedies African countries have tried to address the impact of the Cold War with their policies? It scrolled up. Let's see. If extensive, what are some of the remedies African countries have tried to address the impact of the Cold War with their policies? Examples could be border splitting or reunification or other.
Okay. So first off, I would say this would be a great opportunity if my co-author was here, because he focused his dissertation research focused on the Cold War in Africa, and he wrote the Cold War chapter in the book. But the Cold War was not cold in many countries in Africa, in the sense that it became very hot. Many proxy wars were fought within Africa, including in Angola and Mozambique and the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia and Somalia. And certainly those conflicts at that time created a good number of refugees. But then with the end of the Cold War, most of those conflicts ended or moved into some different stage. And so in fact, in the early 90s, there was this hope that now that the Cold War was over, there wouldn't be these proxy wars and Africa would not experience those conflicts. And then unfortunately, what you saw was other types of conflicts in places like Rwanda and Liberia and Somalia. On the question of borders, so I would say that the border issue goes back not to the Cold War, but earlier to the 1884-85 Berlin Conference, where a bunch of European leaders sat around a table in Berlin, which is obviously not in Africa, and divided up the continent amongst themselves. And yet, interestingly, as independence came to African countries in the late 50s, early 60s, in the late 50s, before independence, many African leaders were talking about the need to do away with these imposed colonial borders. But by 1963, 1964, when they formed the Organization of African Unity, they actually passed a resolution basically asserting the sanctity of those colonial borders. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But of course, one big thing that had changed in just a few years is that now you had independent countries with recognized leaders of those countries, and none of those leaders wanted to give up their area, which may have been necessary if you did away with all these borders. Having said that, there have been a few situations where borders from the colonial era changed, not a lot. But I mean, for example, Tanzania, where I spent my time, Tanzania was actually Tanganyika and Zanzibar, two separate colonies that then merged in the mid 60s, basically because the leader of Zanzibar felt under threat and felt that he could get protection by joining with the larger country of Tanganyika. You, of course, had in 1993 the independence of Eritrea from Ethiopia, but if you go back in history, it had been colonized, it had been a separate colony, so that was sort of going back to the colonial borders. And in some ways, the independence of South Sudan in 2011 was also a return to colonial borders, because that South Sudan had actually been administered separately in the colonial era from what we know as Sudan. So those borders, despite the fact that they were imposed from outside, they really have taken on a lot of meaning in the current day, and I think it would be very difficult to imagine exactly how they would get rid of them at this point. So,
we've got plenty of questions. We won't be here all night, but we're going to keep it going.
Okay.
Earlier in the talk, you mentioned that more democratic countries in Africa are more likely to be against investment and aid from China. Is the pressure mostly coming from domestic voters or from foreign democratic countries that might make their aid conditional or contingent upon investments on cutting ties with authoritarian regimes, especially China?
Right. To some extent, I would say both, but I think more of what I've witnessed is domestic debate within these countries. And I think that has increased in many countries. Zambia certainly has seen a lot of that. But I think about when I was in Kenya in 2006, I guess it was, we organized a conference at the university where I was teaching in Nairobi that was focused on Africa's international relations. And there were various people who came from, it was mainly an East African conference, maybe mainly people coming from within East Africa. And one of my good friends, a Kenyan academic, gave a presentation about China's role in Africa. And at the time, there weren't a lot of people in Kenya questioning China's growing involvement there. But he made an argument. He said, it was very controversial. He said, just because your wife nags a lot doesn't mean that you should find a mistress. And his argument was that the nagging wife is the West that's putting all sorts of demands and saying we want democracy and we want fighting corruption and things like that. Of course, only when it's convenient for us, which is a whole different part of that story. And China is the mistress in this case, and he got a lot of pushback for that. To me, you saw more of that sentiment being expressed in the ensuing years. Questions about whether China was really the right partner, and particularly human rights groups in places like Zimbabwe have challenged, because China has sort of blindly supported the authoritarian government in Zimbabwe, especially under Mugabe, and so human rights groups have said, listen, this is a problem. To the extent, in fact, that I'm going to forget the year now, but at one point there was a shipment of weapons that was trying to get to Zimbabwe, but Zimbabwe is landlocked, so it had to come through a port in South Africa, and it was actually port workers in South Africa that refused to offload the shipment to go to Zimbabwe. The ship had to leave. It went to a few other countries, and each of them said, no, we're not going to allow those weapons to get to Zimbabwe. And eventually, I believe the ship left. And so this sentiment there's certainly a lot of people that are questioning China's support for authoritarian regimes in the region. A lot of people within Africa, not just coming from Western influence.
Well, and staying on that track to a degree, what roles are the regional economic blocs, such as, and I don't know these acronyms, such as SADC,
SADC,
EAS, and ECOWAS,
ECOWAS, yep.
What roles are these regional blocs playing in managing interborder migration? How does national politics respond to these regional interests?
So it's a great question, and I don't want to be too cynical about some of these organizations. Because they do try to do some regulations and try to do some agreements and things. Whether those always make a meaningful difference for people on the ground, I think is a worthwhile question. But you have seen some of these organizations become a bit stronger and a bit more effective in some of the things that they're doing. So for example, when you look at the East African community, originally the East African community formed in the late 1960s, I believe it was 1967, between Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And it had fallen apart within 10 years, basically because you had very different interests of each of the three. You had Idi Amin came to power in Uganda. He and Nyerere in Tanzania did not get along very well. There were all sorts of things going on, but they didn't have a common vision of sort of how to organize their economies and how to move forward. So it fell apart, but then it has been revived more recently and now has added additional members. And now there's a desire. I mean, other countries want to join the East African community. Through that, they have things like an East African passport, which makes it easier to move within the region. They facilitate trade. They've moved towards, not all countries in the EAC have joined it, but they've moved towards a common external, so you can, if you're a tourist traveling there, you could get a visa for one country and go to multiple countries within that grouping, which of course is meant to encourage more tourism. More complicated these days, obviously, and they're encouraging more trade. One of the challenges has been that most African countries are actually members of multiple regional groupings. So there's a lot of overlap between these different groups. So like you have Tanzania being in the East African community, but also in SADC, the Southern Area Development Community. And so it means then, so that when they're negotiating with one group, how does that affect their negotiations with others and stuff? And so what the AU, the African Union, has been trying to do is streamline it a bit more and have sort of a designated group for each region. But you can't just, it's not that easy to just like wave a magic wand and get rid of some of those organizations, right? They have vested interests. And so it's taking a while to get things aligned a bit more in a sort of more effective, streamlined way.
All right. Well, you aced the quiz on acronyms, right? Another question, someone points out that although you use South Africa as your case study on migration, how important was the relationship between the EU and Morocco, I think, West Sahara slash Mauritania, when discussing migration in your book. So basically, they're saying, even though you use South Africa, how does the relationship between the EU and Morocco and West Sahara and Mauritania fit into your discussion of migration?
So it's a fascinating area. I mean, John and I sort of made a decision because there's so many countries and areas of focus. We ended up not spending as much time on North Africa in the book, and we did not use any North African cases. Having said that, this has become a particular area of focus. I would recommend Kelsey Norman's work on Morocco in particular. But a lot of what the EU has been doing in recent years has sort of been trying to externalize their borders, right? So rather than they try to prevent people from reaching their borders, because if they reach the EU and make an asylum claim, then there's certain rights to which they are entitled. And so they instead try to get North African countries to basically prevent African migrants from leaving and going to Europe. And so they've entered into some of these agreements with different countries, basically for processing things within North Africa before migrants ever leave to try to get to Europe. And it's become controversial. I mean, this, of course, has also become controversial. The EU's agreement with Turkey, basically, paying Turkey to keep Syrian refugees and others rather than letting them move on to Europe. And I would say in general, the international refugee regime, it's largely premised on this idea that rich countries will pay to keep refugees in poor countries. And we really have to think about whether that fulfills the goal of burden sharing. I would argue that it doesn't. And so most of the burden of hosting refugees is falling disproportionately on poor countries in the world. So now that's particularly on the issue of refugees, but you're also seeing this extend to migrants and in fact, oftentimes trying to define refugees as migrants so that they're not entitled to the same rights in order to block their passage. And so there's real need for attention to this at a global level because certain countries are carrying the burden of this and others are not.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Now, we haven't been identifying the folks who have been providing questions, but I'm going to take a wild guess that you'll figure out who this is.
Okay.
So, Dr. Whitaker, viewers in South Florida would like to know what you think of Ethiopia's new Grand Renaissance Dam and the politics of water
Thanks,
in the Horn of Africa and Egypt.
Oh, I should punt this to him, but thanks, John. So yeah, this has been getting some attention lately, and I think it speaks to a broader issue that when we think about conflicts over resources, it's not always things like diamonds or oil, right? It can be something as basic as water. And so a lot of what's going on with the Ethiopian project there is that it goes back to some agreements during the colonial era where basically Egypt got like veto power over doing anything with the water on the Nile. And so that has been a hindrance for countries that are further upriver and want to use the Nile for electricity, but also for irrigation and other things. And so finally, you have a country like Ethiopia just sort of saying, we're going to go ahead with this. But this is then leading Egypt to threaten war. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say I don't think it's going to come to war. But I suspect ultimately what's going to happen is there's going to have to be international donors involved that are going to pay for peace, essentially, in some way. And but it speaks to the issue of water in the region and the weight of some of these colonial era treaties that are still dictating what these countries do many, many years later. And I think that's a concern, certainly. Hopefully he thinks I did okay.
I'm sure you all will have further conversation. Our final question, of course, in some ways I was thinking it would be nice to have a presentation and not talk about COVID-19 at all. But since we're all masked up and living like we're living now, it is somewhat apropos to end with this question. Despite rising numbers of COVID cases in many parts of the world, African countries did not seem to have been as affected by the pandemic. Can you explain, even though you're not a medical
not a medical expert,
specialist.
We're all learning something about COVID these days, aren't we?
And given the fact that you do know a little bit about the continent, what might, in your mind, be influencing that reality? That not that it's not there, but it hasn't had the kind of dramatic impact on the continent as it has in other parts of the world.
Okay, and so yeah, I think this is important and is timely. Obviously, I will say that we're not. For some countries in Africa, we're not entirely sure of the numbers, and because some have been more guarded, shall we say, about announcing them. So I started talking about Tanzania. I might as well mention it again at the end. Basically, what happened in Tanzania is there were some rising case numbers in April, and then the president, who's up for re-election today, is quite authoritarian. He declared a day of prayer, and Tanzania prayed away the coronavirus, and then it was gone. So as of April 29th, there were no new cases, and they haven't announced any. I don't trust those numbers. So we do have to be cautious about the numbers. Having said that, there are a lot of countries that are releasing numbers, and there have been a good number of cases, but we haven't seen nearly as many deaths per capita and things. And I think one major reason for that is that Africa is a very young continent. So something like 60% of the population in Africa is under age 25. You have a very small portion of the population that is over age 60. And we know, everywhere that in terms of the complications related to this virus, it tends to fall disproportionately on older people. So the fact that it's a young continent, I think, is certainly helping. There's lower prevalence of a lot of the pre-existing conditions that seem to be a problem in terms of obesity and diabetes and other things, and those are less prevalent in Africa. It's also important to remember that Africa has a pretty well-established public health infrastructure, right? They already have contact tracing programs and other things in place, not just for sort of really deadly viruses like Ebola in recent years, right? But also for things like tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS. And so they have established public health infrastructure, which I would say sort of people have been more connected to than perhaps people in some other countries have been, connected to their public health infrastructure. And then, I mean, there it could also be you have, less places like this where there's no windows, so less recirculated air, more time outside. I don't know, but I think all of these are probably reasons that you're not seeing quite such high numbers. You have seen varying responses, not surprisingly, so many different countries to the crisis. So you had some very intense shutdowns in South Africa, for example, where everything just like shut suddenly and nothing could be sold, and people got very frustrated with that. And then to the other extreme, where Tanzania just says it doesn't exist. And so you get a wide range on that. But I think on the whole, they have some of these advantages, especially in terms of being a young continent, that means it's less likely to be so deadly there.
All right. Well, that's a pleasant note to end a riveting conversation on. So we'd like to thank you once again, Beth, for sharing with us your journey. And we'd like to thank our audience for joining us. This concludes the presentation for the evening. We hope you've enjoyed this, and please join us in January for Dr. Gregory Gaber's presentation on falling felines and fundamental physics. The date will be announced soon. You all please be safe during the holiday season. We wish you well, and thank you once again.
Thank you.